In a quiet island society, things and memories vanish without a trace. If you've ever been captivated by the dreamlike worlds of Haruki Murakami or I Who Have Never Known Men, then Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police might just haunt you too. Hello, my name is Zach, and I'm a reviewer of mostly science fiction and fantasy, but I also delve into the worlds of comics, manga, personal development, everything in between. And today I'm delving into the English translation of Yoko Ogawa's book from the 90s, which is The Memory Police. It recently got an English translation and has been the rounds on Book Talk, BookTube, Goodreads, whatever you want to call it, but it got on my radar too because it's often recommended for fans of Haruki Murakami or the author of I Who Have Never Known Men or The Vegetarian, all books that I've recently read. So maybe this is right up my alley. It's got a bit of magical realism and it left me feeling sort of so-so at the end. But first, let's dive into just what is it about. So this is a Orwellian fiction / magical realism. The premise of the book is there's this island. We can sort of assume it's a Japanese island because the author is Japanese, but the culture that they describe, it's very sort of Japanese style. So it's an island in Japan, we're assuming, but something is weird is definitely going on. So there's these memory police, the titular memory police from the book, that erase all evidence of something that disappears from the world. So for example, they'll think something like a bird will disappear. And not only will the people not remember the bird, but the memory police, their job is to make sure that a physical representation of a bird, I don't think there actually was a bird in the book, but their job is to completely eradicate the physical manifestation of the thing that disappeared in the memories. So it vanishes from the characters. They sort of have no recollection of the object or concept that was disappeared. And then the memory police delete all physical traces of that object too. So it's an interesting premise, and it drew me in because of that kind of connection to I Who Have Never Known Men and The Vegetarian. And that's sort of where the cool things are. I really liked some parts of it, but then other parts not, of course, but more specifically the ending. So what I liked was that moody atmosphere. As I was reading the book, I really got the feeling of I Who Have Never Known Men, which also takes place on this sort of science fiction-y alternate world that we don't really know where we are or what is going on. And that's kind of how The Memory Police felt, not just because it's set by a Japanese author and it's set in another country, but it also didn't really feel like Earth, I guess you could say. Of course, partly because of the physics of this whole memory police thing, that you're sort of left from a scientific standpoint of how does that even work? How are these people's memories getting deleted? Who's choosing what is deleted? Why is it taken from them? It doesn't seem to be like a ruler, for example. Okay, now they're outlawing this. It's not sort of like a government decision that we don't think. But that's sort of where the payoff at the end, we're left with those open-ended questions, which again kind of brings it back to the I Who Have Never Known Men, which also ends without resolving any of the mystery. So definitely some similarities there in this sort of vagueness of the concept of the world. But the characters that inhabit the world are, of course, the strong point. So there's this outer mystery of the memory police and this vanishing of memories, but then the characters are very strong. So that was definitely a positive note for it, is that we're sort of drawn into the world of what's happening. It's not really a plot-driven book, because the plot really doesn't go anywhere, but the characters themselves, you're really drawn to the characters. And this is another strong point for the book, is the main character is an author. And one thing I found interesting but also confusing was the author / main character is writing a book. So there's also chapters in the book where it's sort of the book within the book. And sometimes when I was reading, if I wasn't paying attention too strongly, I was like, wait, that's not our character and the sort of the two main characters. It's the character's story, which is on a similar path as the character. But yeah, it does get confusing. And this is where I think this book would really do well in sort of a book club setting, because there's so many layers here. There's sort of these allegories of, or symbolism, I guess, not maybe not allegories, but the characters themselves and how they reflect on the inner stories characters, the parallels there. There's also symbolism and stuff probably with where the characters are, what they lose, the people they interact with in the world. It's all very sort of open to interpretation. So this is the book for you if you want to sort of discuss and dissect a lot of the things that are happening here, because there's a lot of symbolism, and I'm sure there are themes and things that I didn't delve into. I'm sort of my surface level read of this, where I was just trying to piece together the story and understand what was happening. But it would be great for that further analysis and in-depth kind of circle/book club discussion of what the author was trying to say with this character. Did this character represent something? Was she trying to show something with this whole basement dynamic? Who are the memory police representing? And I guess for that part, you sort of have to look at this book of when it was written, which was in the 90s, and what influenced the author at that time. But I guess the interesting thing is that the themes are very relevant, I would say, to the modern world in 2025, with things like banned books in the U.S. There's banned things in this memory police book, and how the government is sort of censoring, or whatever the memory police are, but they're censoring certain concepts and things, and then how the people in the world deal with the loss of that thing. So it deals with these issues of loss and memories, and remembering and what was lost, and how the society moves on with no longer having the concept of whatever was gone. Like, sort of a spoiler, but one of the later final things that they lose is one of their legs. So how does society adapt without a leg? And that sort of brings up to a plot point, is because there are some people on the island that somehow are immune to this. And again, this is one of those ending things where we're never told at the end why some people are immune to this. Like, one of the main characters, why is R immune to losing his memories? And why is our female lead, why does she lose them and R doesn't? So we're never really told that. It's, what's going on there, what makes him special, or the people that are special. So like one of the final stories where a single leg, I think it was the left leg, gets deleted, it's out of memory, that everyone sort of adapts and they start walking sort of with a limp, and they learn to survive in the world without a leg. So, but the people that are not affected by the memory police, the memory wiping, they don't have the same sort of limp. And even though they try to hide that they have, both functioning legs, that they can understand that their other leg is working, that the memory police can kind of suss out that they are faking it on their lack of memory loss, I'd say. So it's interesting, but again, because we're not sort of given the answers to these questions, it left me a bit unfulfilled. So interesting premise, interesting characters, but sort of the negatives was that at the end we're sort of left to interpret what was happening, what's the next step in the story, and where do we go from here. So I feel the story, the first maybe half of the book was interesting because, again, we're just sort of getting into the world and we're learning about the world, but then it sort of drags in the middle towards the end. It doesn't really come to, at least for me, a satisfying conclusion, because we're given no payoff into what the characters are doing and what their the outcome or the world. There's no secrets revealed. Or whereas at least in I Who Have Never Known Men, it sort of comes to a finality, and we're sort of left with the characters kind of like on a film that they just ride off into the sunset per se. That's totally not what happens, but trying to be very vague and spoilery. But we're sort of left with at least a closure to a chapter of the story, even though the character kind of goes on and we're left to kind of wonder what's next. In the Memory Police, we're left to wonder what's next, but with the very open-ended sort of closure of sort of one crisis happens and it's resolved, our kind of main plot point. But we're just totally still left in the story. But to talk about a little of the positives, why I compare this to not just I Who Have Never Known Men, which has that same kind of weird dystopian world feel, it also feels a lot like The Vegetarian by Hong Kong, which has this weird something is going on. Like, again, in The Vegetarian, she's like turning into a tree. Here in The Memory Police, there's also that like something weird under the surface, which is the memory deletion. But what most really reminded this was just Haruki Murakami in general. So if you've ever read had sort of magical realism. Just, I guess the town and the world really reminded me of, I've only read two, but it reminded me of the two Haruki Murakami books that I've read. It just felt like sort of his world, that I was in this world, in this, maybe it's the Japanese setting, but in this Japanese town, and the mannerisms and the writing style, and just felt very, magical realist. It just felt like otherworldly, but still grounded in reality, but everyone's sort of disconnected at the same time. So it had that very interesting feeling, and I liked that. I liked being in the world. I felt it was an interesting world to live in for our characters, and it sort of kept me at least to finish the book, because I was hoping to kind of get a payoff of the plot, but even though that never happened, it was still interesting and a good ride. So if I had to give it like a rating at the end, I would unfortunately probably harshly rate it like a 3 out of 5, just because the lack of payoff and sort of the second half of the book, the structure, just not there. It just peters out in the middle with the momentum that once we're kind of understand more of this memory wiping in the memory world, once we kind of go into the hiding part of the story, that the second half just doesn't really pan out, and I didn't really enjoy it that much. But I did finish it, and I thought it was an okay read. It was about a 3 out of 5, and I would recommend this to book clubs in particular, because I think it would be an interesting point of discussion to unravel some of the layers and some of the nuances of both the characters, the main cast and the supporting cast that our main characters meet throughout their story, and the story in the story. I think there's probably a piece there to interpret and delve deeper in. So it's really interesting to kind of talk about and maybe hypothesize of what's going on, and that could lead to a good novel. But if you want some closure, like myself, who reads a lot of science fiction, fantasy, not to be stereotypical there, but there's usually some sort of build up and maybe a final battle, or at least some kind of resolution of the plot, which was lacking here, and why I felt the book was lacking as a whole and sort of ended on a sort of a not so high note. So thanks for watching this review and my thoughts of Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police. Do check it out if you want that magical realism and that sort of dystopian Orwellian future. It might scratch that itch for you. So have a great day.